Food is everything. Food is not just food. And how can you say just? Like, what do you mean just food? Food is everything.
Everybody's a part of this climate change clusterfuck, if you will. Like, we'll call it that. It's a fiasco.
When my daughter was born, you want gluten-free bread? Go fuck yourself, basically.
Right. That's when I walked away feeling like I was duped by the food system. And so I said, there is a food and health connection.
Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. On today's episode, my conversation with Melissa L. Jones. Melissa is the host of the Edible Activist Podcast, which is a podcast that focuses on the intersection of health, food, and agriculture, and specifically elevates the voices of people of color who work in this space. On today's episode, Melissa and I cover many topics that intersect with food, food access, food justice, and the environment. We discuss Melissa's personal background and how she felt called to work in this space. We also talk about each individual person's unique journey into understanding how food impacts their health and the environment and how it's all connected. I hope that after this episode, you'll go and check out Melissa's podcast because it's truly incredible and she is a gifted storyteller. But for now, please enjoy my conversation with Melissa L. Jones. Melissa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
It's my pleasure. I'm very excited. And I want to jump right into the personal buy-in for you. You know, why is this topic of food and health so personally meaningful to you? Because, you know, everyone eats, everyone interacts with food, but for some of us, there's more of a calling that pulls us here. So I'd love to jump right into what is that for you?
Absolutely. It's definitely a calling. And I have to start with a story, which is a story of mom, of how I landed here. So back in, goodness, charge my head, not my heart. I want to say 2007, 2009. Actually, I think it was 2009. I was living in New York City at the time. During that time, my mom was experiencing some health challenges, like her jaw would swell up and she didn't know why. So instead of going to a traditional doctor, someone recommended to her, go see a holistic doctor about your jaw. Mind you, my mother, Southern from Alabama, grew up eating everything on the land, every part of the pig, dietitian, like counter calories, everything, exercise. And then like she has like this health hiccup, right? And so she goes to see a holistic doctor. She goes and the holistic doctor says, have you thought about excluding gluten out of your diet? And she's just like, no, I'm from Alabama. Why would I do such a thing? Like, what does that mean? Like, remove gluten out of my diet. And so he said you might have intolerance to gluten and you should try eliminating all gluten, anything that has gluten in it for a certain time to see if the swelling goes down. So she did just that. She eliminated like breads, anything that had gluten in it, and her jaw went down. And so now she's like, okay. So I think she tried to eat gluten at some other point of her life, or like not too far from like when that incident had happened, and her jaw swelled back up. And so she knew, she was just like, I can't eat gluten. Like literally she would like look like someone punched her in the jaw. And so at that point she said, okay, y'all. Like she gathered me, my sister, and she said, listen, we got to kind of dive into like this food and health connection. At that time, the documentary Forks Over Knives was out. And so she said, we're going to go see this. I think we went to like East Street Cinema down in DC to go see the documentary. And for those who have not seen it, I mean, it's obviously been around forever, but it essentially takes like a few patients on this journey. Like they pretty much transform like everything that's in their cabinet, removing all the junk. These folks or patients rather, or individuals, they are suffering from high blood pressure, all the things are on all sorts of medication. And they're like, listen, let's go to Whole Foods. Let's buy, all plant-based stuff, let's buy healthy stuff, and let's get rid of the crap that's in your kitchen, right? And so they do that, and so they do this experiment, and they notice that, I don't know, like, after a week, for maybe some days, weeks, that, like, either they don't have to take any more medication or they eliminated a lot of the medication that they had to take, and so we're sitting in the movie theater, and we're like, "Huh." So that was a significant marker in my life. And that's when I walked away feeling like I was duped by the food system. And so I said, there is a food and health connection. And I never knew that. My parents, Southern, great grandparents, Southern, my parents came to Maryland when me and my sister were babies. We were born in Maryland, but we were still eating all the things. I'm telling every part of the pig, right? And so, like, this food and health connection just was, it was still just like a big question mark, like, what the hell? Like, and so, that I call that the story of mom, because that really was the catalyst to, like, really springing into, like, this whole space of, like, learning about the 2 and how the 2 connect and how the 2 are interrelated. So, from there, I was on this spree. Like, me and my mom, more specifically, we read the China Study. We're reading all these, like, wonderful books about, like, plant-based studies and, like, health, and I even started getting into soil health. I'm reading soil books and learning about the importance of soil. And so I was like, the food system is a monopoly. I was like, I feel really duped. I feel really duped. And so um immersed myself in really just self-learning. That's what it was. Like, it was self-learning for me, self-learning from my mother, and, I actually started transforming my diet as well. Actually, I even had went vegan at one point, for a couple years, and I had noticed the benefits of, like, changing my diet. But fast forward from there, when I immersed myself in this space to really learn about, like, the health and food connection, I found myself in spaces that around individuals or professionals who did not look like me. And so that, to me, that was concerning. And I was just like, well, I'm here learning about soil. I'm now learning about more about farming. I'm learning more about food. But I said, where are the Black people also learning about this? And so from there, after, like, again, self immersion, self study, I kind of went on this path of, like, you know what? I want to start talking to the Black people who are in this space, the Black people who reflect the communities who are deeply impacted, by food insecurity, by, just the overall, like, health of our country. And so that, again, it's like starts with the story of mom, but then leads me down this pathway and this self-discovery, if you will, to where I am now, just being bought in to my belief, what I believe, is a way to really heal your body, heal community. So
Yeah. And I love your story because I have a flip story, right? For
mm,
me, my introduction was my daughter. My daughter had a health challenge, and in exploring what role food was playing in her health challenge, I had this huge aha moment. I went on this journey of self discovery. I started self studying and reading. But I think it's cool in both of our cases, and I think maybe not everyone necessarily knows this, that it's not always a personal health crisis that sends someone down this path. It can start because someone that you care about needs to make a change. And so I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, well, I don't know, like for me, like I feel fine, like what's the big deal?" But sometimes you trip and fall into it because a person that you love is making a change and you witness how powerful it is for them, and that's the aha moment. So for you it
mm.
was your mom, for me it was being a mom and being like, "Why is my baby so sick, and how come nobody has any answers to that?" So, anyway, in both of our cases, from one side or the other, there was this learning that was happening in partnership, and because we really cared about someone else and needed to help them heal, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're spot on. I honestly don't, if it was not that significant marker when my mother's jaw blew up, and she was experiencing those health challenges, I can't say that I wouldn't be in the space that I'm in right now, but I think that that journey, that path would look very differently. And who knows, it could have been something that I didn't tap into until, like, maybe a year ago. But we're talking what, goodness, my mind, like 10 plus years ago,
Right.
right? And so, because it didn't happen to me, but it also doesn't say that something else couldn't have happened to me or another family member that really would have been this catalyst to like really diving into this space. So, true statement.
Right, and it's funny because you said for your mom it was like 2007, 2008.
Hmm.
My daughter was born in '06, so it was right around the same time. So we've kind of tracked along the same timeline, and so I know how much has changed over those 18 to 20 years. Like, when my daughter was born, you want gluten-free bread? Go fuck yourself,
Right.
basically. Right?
What is
Now
that?
right, like, what's that? Where could
Yeah.
you find it?
Hmm.
Now you could actually go to a restaurant, many places,
Hmm.
and order a gluten-free pizza or a gluten-free sandwich, but that was not the case. So your mom was not just making this dietary change that for a listener today, they hear this, they go, "Oh, yeah, well, if I had to go gluten-free, I could
Hmm.
always grab that sandwich at that one place in town, like, I've seen their gluten-free menu." No. This was going gluten-free in the Wild West,
In the
in a
Wild
time
West.
that that was not a thing, that it was not cool, and it was not easy or convenient on any level. So part of the joy in that is that it forced you to learn how to cook. At least that was my experience. You
Yeah.
couldn't just go gluten-free cash. You had to go gluten-free and really, really put your all into it. I
Yeah.
mean, did your mom really have to redevelop her cooking skills? Like, how did she take that on?
Well, that's a funny question. And she's probably laughing right now as you ask that question because though my mother is a Southerner at heart from the sticks of Alabama, Butler to be specific, a very small town, grew up on the land. They had access to every fruit tree, chicken, everything running around, like literally from like yard to table. She did not grow up cooking, which is so funny. So we came to Maryland and like, yeah, we were eating chitlins and I'm telling y'all, we ate everything, like she could cook like some southern staples, but like my dad's side of the family, they throw down way more. But to your point, imagine, let's just say what now we're talking. I think this happened in like 2008, 2009, but let's just say around that time. Imagine Thanksgiving, right? Sitting at the table in Mississippi, Black Southern family, and you're telling your family, I can't eat any of this because now I'm a vegan. Like, literally picture that, right? And like all of my family members being like, what the hell? Like, what is that? I think even till this day, they still don't know. And so, however, she did have to readjust, even though she wasn't cooking the thing, it was now being on this hunt for like, where can I get a really good quality gluten-free bread?
Mhm.
Where like really sourcing that. And I will say my mother is damn good at finding a place that sells really great quality plant-based vegan stuff cuz all vegan food is not healthy food. So let's
Mhm.
just make that clear too, right? And so there was definitely an adjustment. There was an adjustment to how she cooked, and there was an adjustment to like just being out. And when you think about, even though my mom isn't like a big like socializing person, when you think about being out with people, that brings its own dynamic too, right? Because you're out in a restaurant environment and like they're ordering, steak and whatever, which is, I'm not shaming steak. But it's her having to also sometimes like that awkward moment of looking at the menu and saying, is there something on here for me? So there is, yes, having to readjust in like how you cook, how you source your food, like even doing the research of like, is this really just good quality stuff? Are you just saying vegan? Are you just saying gluten free? That's not enough for it to just be healthy, right? But then also that dynamic of being in a social space of like not feeling awkward when you look at a menu and be like, is there something on here for me?
Yeah. I really want to focus on that phrase because it's come up on previous episodes. I have a close friend who's a type 1 diabetic,
Mm,
and he used that phrasing. What here is for me? Like, is there something for me here? And I've had that experience as a gluten free person, as someone with food sensitivities, as a mom of a kid with real scary, go to the hospital, risk your life
mm,
food allergies. Being in food spaces, social environments that are very food connected and feeling like, is there something here for me? But part of the reason I kind of want to sit on that phrase is because of what you were talking about just a moment ago, which is being a Black woman entering the space of soil health and agriculture and organic and veganism and looking around and going, what's here for me?
Mhm.
Who else who has a similar background to me, who looks like me, who I can relate to right here, right now, is here? And if they're not here, why not? And
Mhm.
how can I bring them into this space? So I want to kind of jump off from that to your podcast and the storytelling that you're doing, because I think that another thing that you and I have in common is storytelling as a public health service, right? Using storytelling to improve health. So let's talk about the podcast. How did it begin?
Yay. So that's my baby, Edible Activist. A very fun play on words. So we do not talk about edibles, y'all. But if you want to, we
You
can.
could. You could.
Not
We're open to it.
We're open to it. We're not shaming edibles. And listen, the cannabis industry is a very important one too. But the platform. So let me take a step back. So going back to being in those spaces where I'm showing up and I don't see anyone who looks like me, right? So in my mind, or maybe not necessarily in my mind, but I am the great granddaughter of a sharecropper, who hails from Mississippi. And so knowing what I know about the history of black land, black farmers, it was very eerie to me to not see black people showing up in this space. And I don't say that in a way to like shame them, as I got further along in like my discovery, I came to a lot of conclusions as into why I didn't see them showing up in this space. And so when I again was in these spaces and I said, listen, I probably see maybe one or two other black people, but they're not, it's mostly white people. I'm around a lot of white people right now who seem really vested in like soil health and food and policy, and so I took it upon myself. So before actually the podcast, I started doing events. And so I was like, well, you know what? Let me just start putting on like some educational events. I think I started calling it good soil events. So I have like book clubs, and I would do like storytelling events where like people would show up. I think I did a couple things at not Union Market, but some venue near there. And so where I would invite people to like show up and like share their food story. And so, but then I started to like really niche down and say, I really want to center this around black people, primarily black people and people of color, and really hear their stories and how they connect back to the land. And that was very important to me because I felt like at that point in time, our voices were not being included in the story, in considering that we have a long-standing history with the land, right? And so I think it was one day I was actually invited to a podcast studio in DC to do an interview with actually a pretty big chef. I won't say her name, pretty big chef. And so that's when I was actually introduced to the studio, and I was sitting there and I said, I can do a podcast. I said, let me think about this. So I wrote up a concept. I talked to a producer, shout out Jack, and he said, let's rock with it. And so that my podcast, Edible Activist, was birthed in or born in 2018. I want to say it's what 5 years. I can't do math, y'all. And so so my podcast, amplifies the voices of Black people primarily and people of color in the food and ag space in all intersections, right? So, we're talking about urban agriculture, we're talking about social justice, we're even talking about housing as it relates to food, right? And having safe spaces. And so we talk a lot about tradition, and really going back to like, what did grandma used to cook, in the kitchen, and just really connecting those stories of like food used to be this back in the day. It's a little different, even though there's some aspects where it's gotten better, but like really bringing tradition into like the fold of these conversations, because a lot of the folks who've actually been on my show, that has actually been their first time doing an interview. So just really creating the stage for them to share their story, but then also to really have that real life moment of like, damn, like I was connected to the land when I was younger, and like they didn't appreciate it when they were younger, right? And so yeah, so that is Edible Activists, and over 100 episodes, and I'm just so thrilled with it and just happy that I have an opportunity to invite who I actually call the storytellers. I'm leading the conversation, but I really do look at them as the storyteller, the subject matter, expert, even though they probably hate that word, but they are sharing their own story, and I am the platform that gives them I offer the platform for them to be able to do that.
Yeah, and it's an awesome podcast. I've listened to it and I've really
Thank you.
enjoyed some of the episodes that I've heard. And it's a very like comfortable environment. Like you can hear that the guest is at ease, that they're enjoying their time there. And you had a recent episode that was with a whole group of students who were these student gardeners. And they were so excited to be there. There were some who you could hear they were more
Mm.
shy, but over the course of the episode, they were chiming in, they were sharing their voice. There was so much community
Mhm.
evident in just that podcasting space. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, about the role of community in this work, because I do feel like you're not just a podcast host and an activist and a sort of event planner and
Mhm.
builder and sharer, but you're really a community person. So can you speak a bit more about that?
I can. I'll say that community is what you make it, and it's very easy to toss the word community around and it really not be a community. So I want to be very I want to be very just forefront in that. And so the episode that you brought up with the students so that was from Common Good City Farms, and these group of students, they do a summer program and they are amazing. The farm brought me in to lead like a storytelling podcasting host session. And so for the second session, I said it would be neat for you all to come in and like just do an episode. There's no pressure, just like talk, right? But I love that space that was cultivated because you could tell in that moment, like these group of students, like that was a community. They like built relationships over the summer. They actually just gave so much credit to like their team leads of just like how like they've created a space that they deem safe for them and that they felt included. And so for me, like that was a true reflection of community. As I look back when I started Edible Activist in 2018, I did not have community at the forefront of my mind, not because it wasn't anything that I wasn't thinking about, but now fast forward to 2024, I'm like, damn, like I have built this like really incredible, amazing community of like activists to the point that when I have my events and it's over, these folks are like after hours still chatting, they are exchanging information, they are making connections, they are sourcing from one another. I had one person told me that they're now sitting on like some working group or board. There's a lot of these things happening, and I don't know until someone tells me, and I'm like, that's great. Like, that's amazing. And so, this community that I've built has been like really incredible. And it is, to me, that's a reflection of community, like these authentic relationships, these spaces where you feel like you can be yourself. Because if you don't feel like you can be yourself, if you don't feel like you can speak your truth, then I don't know how you can build community. But because the group of people that I've interviewed and they have so much in common, and for some, they may not have anything in common with some of these stories, it's been an incredible thing to witness, and it comes out when I do my events. I'm like, "Damn, like, y'all are great, and y'all are some good-looking people."
You're beautiful, you're magical.
Yes.
Yeah, there's something about people, at least I've found this, that when I meet people at this very specific niche intersection, like health, food, soil, agriculture, the fact that it's all connected, the fact that what you eat changes how you feel, like when I happen to be in a room where everyone is on that vibe, which is a very specific vibe,
Very
because
specific.
you can meet the healthy food people who don't think at all about the land, and you can
Mhm.
meet the land people who don't think at all about how food is working in their bodies. I've studied with scientists who are brilliant, top of their field microbiome researchers, and they have said to me, this is a real quote, I never really thought about how my diet impacted my microbiome. Really? All right. So when you meet people who are actually in this very tight intersection, my experience is like they're great. Like they're the best people. And maybe that's because I'm that weirdo and I've just been searching for my weirdos. But I've been in a lot of rooms where I'm like, okay, like I can pretend to fit in here. I don't, but I can pretend
Mhm.
to. But when I've found myself in rooms of this unique type of person who is like, food and land and the air and the water and social justice and it's all connected, that's the room where I'm like, "Oh, like, I can kinda just let my hair down and not worry about it, like, people here actually kinda get me, and it's okay."
And it's okay, exactly. One of my best friends, and she didn't say this because she's being biased, like, she comes to my stuff and she says, "I love coming to your events, they're a whole vibe." That's what the youngins are saying, "It's a whole vibe."
It's a
And I'm
whole
like,
vibe.
"It is a whole vibe."
It is. It's an entire vibe.
It is, and that's what I aim to create. And just back to your note of, when you listen to my show, like, it just seems like you're in a living room and it's comfortable. That is the intention that I set.
Yeah.
That is the intention that I set, and so I aim to set that for every guest that comes in. I can't think I may out of all the guests I've interviewed, I've probably interviewed maybe one person where the vibes might have been off, and they actually didn't end up making the show for other reasons, actually. But I think I do a great job in attracting some really great people, so
Yeah, yeah, and
Mm.
and and it's so important. The vibe is important.
It
I have a question, which is, I'm going a little bit off of my sort of script, but there's this meme that really bothers me. Okay, it's meant to be a feminist meme. It says something. This might be a quote or a slight paraphrase, but the meme says something like, "We're gonna raise daughters so strong that you won't be able to get them back in the kitchen." And I understand what the meme is trying to say. It's trying to say something like women should be allowed to do whatever they want, and empowerment means female freedom. And I'm about that. I'm a feminist or whatever. I'm a woman with 3 daughters and we do whatever we want, basically. But I spend hours in the kitchen. And I don't think that the kitchen is a dirty word, right? I mean, I laugh a lot about like I'm barefoot in the kitchen. Like the one thing I'm not is pregnant, and I've been that quite a few times too. So the meme bothers me because the implication is that for a woman to be in the kitchen is oppressive. But to me, being in the kitchen is the most empowering thing you can do. And this is a long way of asking, in the agricultural spaces, you were saying, Black people have a deep history with the land. Is there something like that going on? Like for Black people, is there something like, well, maybe I don't wanna be on the land. Like, maybe that wasn't a choice for my great-grandfather, but I have a choice, like this person sharing this meme. Well, my great-grandma had to be in the kitchen, but, like, if I wanna be in the boardroom, I'm not gonna be in the kitchen. Is there something going on there where it's, like, about empowerment? And you and I would say, "But it's really empowering to be on the land, and it's really empowering to be in the kitchen," but, like, not everyone's there. Like, some people are still, like, working out what their choice is.
That's a really great question. So, in short, definitely a subset of black folks are like, "I'm not stepping my baby toe on the land." Okay? I think it's to me, I feel like it's less about empowerment. To them, it might feel like empowerment. I think there is, like, this very bad misconception around, like, Black people on the land, right? And maybe I shouldn't label it as bad because I also just wanna be fair and saying, like, your perspective is your perspective, right? Because there's a lot of trauma, obviously, that's happened on the land. And so, I believe when those statements are made, it's thinking about our longstanding history that we do have with the land that was very traumatic,
Right.
So, in that respect, I mean, to answer your question, I think it's coming from that lens of, like, listen, my great 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 grandmother was enslaved and had to work the land. I don't want any parts of it. It's definitely true for
Right.
some of the Black community, absolutely. Then you have another part, another subset of the Black community that's just like, no, this is empowering, empowering that my great grands were on this land and I get to touch the very soil or at least be close to what they did in their trade and to do a thing. But the empowerment comes in that I get to do this for myself and I get to feed my family. This is not, this is more about empowering me and empowering my family,
Yeah.
and absolutely. And again, I don't shame them. There's never a conversation. I don't think anybody should be forced to have a relationship with the land. Either you do or you don't. But I think it's more so sometimes it's a I don't want to say it's a silly joke. Sometimes it's just like, okay, guys, like really, but it's more so just around the fact of the history that we have with the land and it's just being so traumatic of like, why would I want to step foot on the land? Why would I
Right.
want to step foot on a place where, the white slave owner, literally, dictated my family's every move and changed their names and sold their kids off. I get it.
Right.
I totally get it. And, I don't even think there's an ask for me to say, hey, just like, you know, there's definitely a lot of repair that needs to happen. There's a lot of acknowledgement that needs to happen. But I give people that space to say, listen, I hear you. I absolutely hear you. So Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and I think, that ties into something that I'm passionate about kind of broadly, which is this idea that the opposite of bad isn't necessarily good, and the opposite of good isn't necessarily bad. So people's knee-jerk reaction is often like, "Well, that's how I was raised and I hated it, so I'm gonna do the opposite." And I've tried that, and it's like you do the polar opposite and you're gonna mess that up too. There's always, like, some gray area in the middle. So, same thing, like, I don't judge anyone that shares that meme, like, "You're never gonna get me back in the kitchen." I get it, right? If you
Mhm.
watched your mom or your grandma kinda stuck in the kitchen making dinner for your grandpa every night and she wished she was doing something else, but that was her duty as a wife or whatever it was,
Mhm.
I could see that that wouldn't be your ideal.
Yeah.
But I also know that to really empower yourself, you might wanna touch your food and get to know it and know where it comes from, and so there's always so many layers to unpack, and that's part of the reason that I love the food conversation. Last night I was on social media. Confession, I went on Instagram, I wasted 10 minutes and
It's not a bad
someone
place all the time.
there's great things there, like your page. We have to go on sometimes. And there was a dietitian posting about Halloween and about, kind of letting it go, like not being overly restrictive with candy because you're only going to create obsessions. And she said, food is just food. That was her closing line. And I had pretty much agreed with everything she said until that moment. I was like, food is everything. Food is not just food. And how can you say just? Like, what do you mean just food? Food is everything. Food is community. Food is family. Food is struggle. Food is survival. Food is joy. Food is love. Food is community. So it's interesting because I think what she was trying to say was a good thing. Like, don't obsess over candy restriction. Don't give your kids a complex about it. Like, let them eat a few pieces and let it go. But food is just food. How can you
Mm.
say that?
Mm. Well, two comments. And I want to go back to the meme that you had brought up and just want to make the statement of I can't really sit here and debate like the meme. I can't. But what I will say is that Black women have a long-standing history in the kitchen and have created a lot of the recipes and meals that we see today. Okay. We were in the White House. We were everywhere. Okay. So that is definitely the kitchen has always been a place of healing for Black families, for Black women, and so to me, that's always been empowering, right? To the dietitian who said food is just food, who is she? What is her demographics? Where does she live?
Yeah.
So there's so many different angles, right? There is the part of like, listen, there's some people who just live day to day. They're healthy, they're fine. They can eat all the candy corn that they want. The teeth won't fall out. Me and my sister grew up with cavities. It was hell. My mom let us eat whatever. And then there are some folks, who may live in maybe of a certain demographic. And if something does go wrong with your child's teeth, like you have the money to do that. But maybe for a mom or dad who lives in a community where things aren't as accessible, healthcare isn't as accessible, they're probably not, they may say food is food, or they may not be saying food is just food. So I think I have so many questions of like who is saying that.
Right.
But I think the way that, and not knowing who said that, the way that I interpret it is that there's some folks, I mean, just going back to your comment earlier of like, there's some people who care deeply about policy, but they're not stepping foot on the land. They're like, I don't care about farming. That's fine. You know, there are some people who are in urban ag and they're like, forget policy. That's just a real thing, right?
Yeah.
But for the persons like food is just food, they may just be living day to day and they're just like, listen, life is delicate. Eat whatever the hell you want. And there's a part of me that does side with that. It's just like, listen, don't stress your nervous system out like stressing over food, right?
Right.
Because we don't want your nervous system to be dysregulated, but it can be due to bad food, right? So there's so many layers and so many angles, but food, all the things that you name, food is community, food is healing, food is empowering, food is everything.
Yeah.
And if you are privileged enough or have the means to have access to a meal every single day, because there's some who don't, for the folks who don't, food is everything to them.
Yeah. And just for the context, her target market, who she specializes in, is like women recovered from eating disorders. So I think
Ah,
she is trying to help them shape a less obsessive
mm-hmm.
lens around food.
That makes sense.
And I get that
That
for
makes
sure.
sense.
But I think, if I were to restate her sentence, I would say food is just, period. Right? Like, food is just everything. It's
Food how
everything.
about food is? You
Food
fill in the
is.
blank.
There you go. Food is
That's a
whatever
t-shirt
it
idea
is
for
to
you.
you. Yes, we
I'm
need that.
famous for giving t-shirt ideas. If you don't know anything else about my show, I'm famous for giving t-shirt ideas.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm always saying things like, "That's my punk rock band name." You know, like you hear like a really weird phrase come out of your mouth, and you're like, "That's my punk rock band." So that's our T-shirt,
Yes.
and hopefully at some point we'll come up with our punk rock band name. Okay, so circling back to the podcast, I know it's your baby, and it's very hard to pick a favorite baby, but I'm curious, looking back over the last maybe couple years, is there a favorite episode, one where you like, after you recorded it, you were up all night because you were so excited, or even one where maybe it wasn't your favorite, but after you put it out, the comments came in like, this episode changed the way I think about XYZ.
Oh, Marian, that is a hard one. I looked at that question. I did look at your questions, and I said, "Oh, I can't just pick one." This is what I will say. I think it was back in 2018, 2019. I did a Kickstarter called it was Edible Activist. I actually think that was the that was the launch actually to my podcast. So I did a Kickstarter for Edible Activists, and essentially what I did is I traveled to Detroit and Philadelphia and then did some like on the ground interviews in DC. And the community in Detroit and those stories, like I did a whole series, is one of my favorite. When we talk about communities, I also recognize that all communities don't look the same, not in terms of like just demographics, but in terms of like energy, in terms of like how people organize together, how people socialize together. They're not the same. Like Detroit is just on a whole nother level. When you talk community, I go to Detroit and I'm like, this is community. I land in Detroit. I'm like, this is community. By far one of my favorite trips, one of my favorite cities, and I got an opportunity to talk to a handful of urban growers and farmers, and just really one of my favorite series on edible activists. So if you guys go back, I think to 2019, 2020, charge my head, not my heart, y'all. Marion. My math and numbers is just all
We
over.
will look it up. We're
But
gonna put a link to that
yes,
one in the
please
show
do.
notes because I want to hear that one.
It was one of my favorite series that I did. So
And can you say more about that? Like, what was it about Detroit that felt like community to you?
So it's funny because Detroit, if you aren't familiar with Detroit, it's a very large city. And in some ways, I love like what I call real cities. I hit Detroit, a real city, Baltimore, a real city. Architecture, the history, the landscape, where the roads go. Like I am for that. My family's from Jackson, Mississippi. When I'm in Detroit, it actually, even though Jackson, Mississippi is way smaller than Detroit, there's some Detroit kind of reminds me of a Jackson. And that's already a draw. Like when I see old buildings, old church buildings. Now the sad thing is that there are a lot of dilapidated homes. There's a whole history behind Detroit and white flight and everything, right? Which is the reason why a lot of these homes are the way that they are, partly. And then there was the recession that happened and the housing crisis rabbit hole, not going down that lane, right? But I think that history in Detroit specifically, it's just something to be said about how they organize together and just like this majestic love that's just like baked into the city that is just ingrained in Detroiters there. And they are hardcore Detroiters. They love being a Detroiter. And so I think with that history, the Black history specifically, obviously in Detroit, it just they just organize differently and they
Mhm.
organize with love. And from what I witnessed and while I was there and from what I know, it's just they just organize different. And to me, it's just a different way in which they build community and like how they come together. So it's really one of those cities where you have to go there to like just really see it and feel it. Cause people used to be like, well, why do you like Detroit so much? I'm like, have you been? And if you tell me no, then don't ask me that.
Yeah.
But you have to go to Detroit. But it's a beautiful place and there's just so much love. And I think it has a lot. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are tons of cities with Black history across the entire US. But when we're talking about Detroit, a lot has happened in Detroit. And I just feel like that has just there's just some love with obviously a lot of trauma, but they're resilient and they're like they've been through some stuff. And I
Yeah.
think with that, they're just built different and they come together in a different way. So,
Yeah. Well, Detroit is actually kind of an interesting jumping off point to my next question because, as you just mentioned, this like rabbit hole that you could go down, Detroit has publicly dealt with water quality issues, housing issues, safety issues, food issues. And so, this again brings us back to the uncomfortable gray area reality that all of these things touch each other, that none of these issues exist in a silo, that food is not just food, that the environment is not just the environment, that it's all connected. So your work now very much centers food and human conversations about food, but also centers these systems. And your work historically has touched on other issues. So you've worked on environmental issues and climate change. So I would love to talk a bit more now about that work, how you see it as connected to your current work. And, let's kind of highlight for the people at home who don't always think about what the heck climate change has to do with the food on their plate. Let's talk a bit more about that.
yeah, no, I'm really excited to touch on this. Climate change is something that I hadn't necessarily baked into my conversations when I started out, with the podcast. I wasn't there yet, but increasingly, I think I'm at this point, and what I'll say is that everybody's a part of this climate change clusterfuck, if you will. Like, we'll call it that. It's a fiasco. And we're battling so much from those who don't think it's climate change to anyway, rabbit hole. But it is increasingly becoming important to me for a number of reasons. I am a super auntie. I have nieces and nephews, and I want them to grow up in a world that is healthy, that is safe, and I want the world to still be here 30, 40, 50 plus years from now. And the way that this climate is warming out of control, it's concerning that it will not be here, right? And so that has a lot to do with our agricultural system. I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole of, animal agriculture, right? We can
CAFOs.
we can go down that road. There's fracking. There is, the processing, or we can talk about GMOs. We can talk about tons of things of how they're destroying land. And it's all those things that just go into play that's really destroying the earth, right? And so when we're talking about that, you're also talking about disrupting communities and families who live in those neighborhoods where the destruction is happening. And so the water isn't clean, the air isn't clean, and so that's rippling a whole nother layer of just like it's a health crisis for communities, right? But when we're talking about agriculture, and I can center like urban agriculture, right? um we can even go down, it was incredibly hot this summer, so we're talking about labor. And if you can't farm because you don't want people falling out and it's 100 plus degrees, who's going to pick your food? Right. And then you don't want too much rain because then your crops get destroyed. And then it can't be too hot because then your crops are going to die. So it is just, and I send love to all of my farmers and my growers because it has been a challenge, especially this year, over the last few years. And this is all induced by climate change, the warming of the climate, because we are not nice to the earth. And there are other ways, there are other things. There's transportation, there's the fashion industry, but all of this is connected. So I'm really excited to actually have more conversations around climate. And so as folks continue to listen to my podcast, they will hear more conversations centered around climate. I also work in the climate space now full time. So that's another exciting lens, but more specifically, it's what farmers and growers have had to navigate specifically with this summer and this heat. It impacts like the food landing on people's plate, and people don't understand that. But that's, I'll say, okay in quotes, because you also have to meet people where they are.
Right. Yeah, again, in my head right now, I'm going a little bit rogue because I'm thinking back to the COVID lockdowns and how there was this conversation about this word that we love in America, which is freedom. And I love freedom. I really do. I love to be free. I love making choices. I'm not asking to be restricted, but there's that question of like, where does my freedom end and your freedom begin? Is my
Mm,
freedom to do something that makes you sick more important than your freedom to leave the house and buy groceries and not worry about dying? You know? So freedom is a slippery word. It's a very malleable word. It means something different to everyone. And so I think about that when I think about like these issues around climate change and food, around choice, right? Freedom and choice. These words they play together quite often. And people will say, oh, well, it's my choice to eat that, or it's my choice to go shopping every day and buy lots of clothes. You mentioned the fashion industry. This is like a pet peeve of mine because I have three daughters and I feel them constantly being marketed to buy, 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 buy. And luckily I am pretty relentless. And I will, let them know that like that company is evil and that's not good and
mhm,
that's slave labor and that's unethical
mhm,
and that's destroying the environment and that's putting plastic into the landfill.
mhm.
But still, that's one voice against a constant bombardment of advertisements for junk food and junk makeup and junk clothes. And we're told that it's freedom to be able to choose from an unlimited assortment of crap that destroys the earth, crap that oppresses people in other countries, crap that doesn't really do anything for us except spike our dopamine for about 5 minutes and then drop it back down again. And we're defining that as freedom and choice. So I've now gone a little bit down a rabbit hole, but it is at this intersection of where all these issues are connected and how maybe as a culture we should start thinking about how can we reframe freedom. Something that I've said to my husband recently is like, I feel the most free when I realize that if the only thing that I did for the rest of my life was sit at home and hang out with my kids, that would be enough for me. That's not to say that's my plan, right? I plan to do many other things, but if something were to happen and my only option was to hang with my kids, I know in my heart that would be enough. And that makes me feel free
Mhm.
because freedom is not just about unlimited consumption, right? But we've kind of been sold the story that it is. And it causes us to be very unkind to the earth because if you believe that the way to exercise your freedom is to never stop consuming, you're going to be digging a very deep hole.
I listen, I touche, touche, touche. If I could just sit with my grandmother and hang with, like, all my family in in Chicago, Mississippi, Florida, I have a big family, I would be A-okay. I actually think about this very often, Miriam. And it's funny because it's contradictory because it's like what folks think is freedom, it really is a chain because you are chained to these systems. Like, they are looping you in and you don't know. It's like this they have like this mental psychological like hook, on you that you just don't it's just a thing that's just rolling around in your system and you're just hooked, you're hooked, you're hooked, and you don't even know you're hooked.
Yeah.
And it isn't freedom. It's not freedom. And so I that's even a question for me just to land on like how to reframe freedom. And when I hear the word freedom now, I honestly I'm like, what does that mean for people?
Mhm.
What does that mean? I'm like, no, you are hooked into a system that's telling you that if you don't buy this serum for your face, you're not going to glow. If
Mhm.
you don't buy the latest whatever, you're not going to be cool. It's no, you're chained. That's not freedom.
Yeah.
You're chained.
Yeah. And it's hard because the messages
It
come at
is.
us constantly and they come from the computer, the internet, the TV, the billboards, driving down the street. I mean, anywhere you go, if you really stop and become conscious
Mm-hmm.
of the messages, we
Mm-hmm.
are bombarded 24/7. And, back in the day, I was introduced to the concept of positive affirmations, right? My knee jerk reaction was, that's so stupid. No way. I'm not doing that. No way. No, yuck,
Just to say
right?
something out loud, what is this
Yeah,
gonna do?
disgusting. It felt yucky to me.
Yeah.
I was like, "I wanna look in the mirror and say, like, you are valid, you are powerful." Like, no way.
But now,
Well, one day I was like, "Wait a second. I'm doing negative affirmations all the time." We all have that inner critic who's like, "You're not good enough, you're not smart enough. What if they don't like you? Are they laughing at you? Do you belong here? Maybe you don't." So I'm doing negative affirmations, not intentionally, but
mm-mm,
I am doing them. And so I
mm-hmm.
thought, okay, fine. I will do positive ones just to break even. I'm not going to go crazy and be some weirdo, but I will do enough just to break even. That was my deal with myself. And it was very powerful to me, you know?
Yes.
And so I bring that up to kind of tie it back to we are bombarded with buy this, buy this, buy this, consume, 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 take this on, feel bad about yourself, buy this makeup. So it's like every time that you just go, I'm not going to buy that, I'm good. Anytime that I go, actually, I'm good, thanks. It's like just breaking even.
Yeah, I mean, also that to me is freedom to be able to tell. I was like, listen, social media, you're not going to tell me that I'm overweight. Just stop.
Yeah.
I don't need to buy X, Y, and Z. Now, can I stand to lose a few pounds? Absolutely, but you're not going to tell me that, my face isn't going to glow. You're essentially telling me that I'm not pretty enough.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to stand up and say, listen, like, I'm good enough and I don't need this shit is empowering
Yeah.
to me and is a level of freedom to say, you're not going to get my dollars wrapped up in that. Like, so
Yes, I
exciting.
unfollowed so many accounts that
Good for
were,
you.
in theory, female empowerment, female bodybuilding and
Mm-hmm.
female fitness.
Mm-hmm.
But I would notice I was looking at them and I was doing the thing in my head where it's like, well, am I supposed to look just like that?
Absolutely. They're telling you that your body is supposed to look like this, so
Yeah.
follow them, and
Right.
that's why I don't want any of that popping up on my feed.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They're gone. I
Yeah,
do not follow them. The only
good for you.
accounts that I follow for female fitness there's a couple moms
Mhm.
who have this message about like actually learning to breathe and like
Which is the
use
most
your
important.
core for real motion
Yes.
and expression.
Yes.
And I love them because they're always like pulling up their shirt and kind of tugging on their loose mommy tummy skin. And I'm like, I have that.
Yes!
And it looks like a real person doing a real thing, and they are super fit, and they're
There you
buff
go.
as heck, and they work really hard, but
Mhm.
it's not like they're not hiding the stretch
And
marks.
that's the problem I have with social media, and I know we don't wanna go down a rabbit hole of social media, but I have to say this. I was just talking to one of my good girlfriends I grew up with and, born in the '80s, grew up in the '90s, like, partied in the early 2000s. We had a time, and while I want everybody to have a good quality of life, like, this era, like, this younger generation that's coming up, I do kinda just feel sorry, like, in that what is being targeted at this generation. And it does break my heart because this generation is coming up. If you don't protect them in whatever way that looks like from the ads, from social media, they are literally looking at the lives of others who are saying, you need to live like this. And honestly, I only believe 0.01% of what I see on social media anyway.
Mhm.
I'm like, half the times these folks are lying. Okay. So
100%. 100%. There's so many accounts convincing my daughter that for like their Easter basket had 10 pairs of Lululemon. I'm like, she just emptied her drawer
that's all she
and put
did.
it in her basket. Like she did not get that this morning. That's insane. There's
Yeah,
absolutely no way. And if she did, her parents are environmental criminals. Like she did
absolutely.
not need 10 Lulus for Easter. This is not even a gift-giving holiday. Like what's happening here? But there's
Exactly.
so much of that. And yeah, like little kids are very vulnerable.
They are. I have a
Um
sensitivity to this
yeah.
generation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Very, I mean, very like, I'm not gonna take no shit, but at the same time, the way that they're being marketed to and just what's floating around, it's just it breaks my heart. It
yeah.
does.
Yeah. So I want to kind of find a way to bring it home a little bit because I do get the sense that you and I could talk forever, maybe. And there are so many rabbit holes and so many pockets of where food and where systems and where social justice are all connected and how we need to elevate these messages and bring people in. But I do want to talk about, what are you up to and where are you going? And this thing that you said, you're like, you're an auntie and you want the world to exist. And like, I feel this personal responsibility. Like, I brought 3 humans innocently to this planet. They didn't ask for that. And the world's on fire. And I have to show up every day and prove to them that I brought them here for a reason, that I have a purpose, that I want to protect the planet. And I have plans to be a great grandma. I'm going to be old and adorable and I'm going to be holding a lot of babies.
I
I
love
have
it.
a vision. So let's talk about, where does this work go for you? What's next? Where are you headed? And how can people come along on that journey? How, well, this is like a twofer. So what's up with you? Where are you headed?
I think it's a three-fer.
It's a three-fer. It's a million fur.
That's a myth.
Shout out to the rabbits for all their holes.
Yes.
But, if you could, where do you think the average person might start? Someone listening to this who's like, damn, I want to get involved. Where does that person start?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, a couple things to answer this three-fer, four-fer. The podcast is a great way just to listen. I don't believe that anyone should just cartwheel into the space and feel like, I want to save the world. You can't, you won't. Stick to a lane, follow that lane, and that's it. There are 1,000,001 things happening. Trust me, we got folks touching just about everything, right? But I do feel like Edible Activist is a really great grounding point. And it warms my heart when I've heard from people who've listened to my episode and they've sent me photos saying, I just listened to this episode and now I have this like whole balcony of like herbs and like food and everything that I'm growing. That warms my heart, right? Or when someone says, I listened to this cousin Chad and now I'm like in a rabbit hole of like learning about my tradition and my lineage. It really is a good grounding space. It's not to, again, everyone who's been on my show, superb, brilliant, amazing. So it's not one of those where it's not academic. So anybody, and that's also the other intention, like everyday conversations that anybody can just jump in, listen to, and feel like, you know what? I get this. I hear y'all. So Edible Activist is a really great grounding point. Always follow me on Food Talks in Color. I think what's up next, and I actually will just give like I guess a bit of a peek or whatever. So like Food Talks in Color is actually going to drop. Everything is going to be Edible Activist. So I'm doing some reframing too. Also, with that reframing, I'm going to have, and I spoke to this a bit earlier, infusing more climate conversations into the fold. Want to do more series around like climate because that really is something that is important to me, near to me. And I want to have more of those conversations and really dive into all the intersections when we talk about racial justice, when we talk about social justice, when we talk about more ag and like how that all crosses over into climate change as well, and climate justice, if you will, just transition, if you will. So can definitely look forward to more of those conversations. I am almost at 170 episodes, so I really want to hit 200. So we talking about where we're headed. Not gonna happen this year, but if I can make that happen the first quarter of 2025, I would love that. That
Yes.
means more work for me, but
Just in all your free time,
and all my free time. Oh gosh, with
It'll
the
be
million
so
emails that I
easy.
haven't read. So definitely that's something that I look forward to and want to celebrate with everyone, to be truthfully honest. But I would say the big things are just really having more series around climate, like really looking out for more climate centered conversations in series, hitting that 200 mark, doing some reframing on like the business back end side, and still having fun. I definitely want to do some more travel with Edible Activists. So in my mind, I'm thinking of like, where do some of those spots look like where I want to venture to? So I'm thinking about that heavily. And then I will actually be doing some promoting for a conference that's happening in, I think it's April of 2025, called Take Nature Black. So I'm actually the media sponsor. So I'll be pushing some information out around that and getting people to attend that conference. That's actually happening in Maryland.
Oh,
So
awesome.
people can look out for that. Otherwise, having fun. I just wrapped up a live podcast event, which was amazing. Those are my babies. I love them. I have a small, intimate audience. They get to watch me interview an amazing person. Interviewed Gail Taylor of 3 Part Harmony Farm in DC. She also farms in Maryland, her and her partner. So can possibly look out for some of those live events as well. But did I answer your 4-fer, 2-fer, 3-fer?
I think that you did. And I was also thinking back to, I think it's the most recent episode of your podcast. Actually, it came out on my birthday, October 14th, where you
Ooh.
spoke with the founder of Everybody's Juice.
Yes.
And his episode, or that one, because I think he's been on before,
Yes.
but his most recent one, I think it's a great kind of microcosm of how a person's journey with health and healing and food and herbs and life can evolve. Because one of the things that I asked is like, well, where do you think a person can start? But the reason that his conversation comes to mind for me is all of us are always starting again and again
Oh my
and
goodness.
again.
Yes.
And I think that a person who feels new to the food and health space might feel like, I don't know, embarrassed to start. Like, oh, I don't know anything about healthy eating, or I don't know anything about herbs or teas or, cleansing, whatever it might be. But I loved his episode because he shared in a way that was like technically vulnerable because he's sharing this like truth, but didn't feel vulnerable. It just felt cool. It was like a friend sharing a story. And he shared how he was healthy, he was fit, he was, whole food, plant-based, juicing, knew so much about healing. And then he had a setback. He had COVID, he didn't feel well, and then he discovers ashwagandha, this
Mhm.
incredibly powerful herb. The reason I bring up this story is that it's this great example of how everyone has somewhere to start, and then we all always have to stay ready to start again and
Absolutely.
again. So I would point people to that episode. It's very easy to find because if you type in edible activist, it'll come up. It was a very recent drop. It's
Yay.
a great conversation. And it's just a really great way to hear someone who's, first of all, he shares his struggle, like business wise, getting a new
Mhm.
fledgling business that you believe in up and running. He shares that journey. But then he also shares, like, you can kind of be on top of your game health wise. You can have a lot of things dialed in, and something can knock you down. And there's like a new piece, a new tool to add to your toolkit. And I think for someone who's just starting out, who feels vulnerable, who feels afraid and not sure where to start, hearing someone like that share in that way how they began again, how they learned this new tool, it
Mhm.
could be very powerful. I found it to be a very powerful story.
Well, damn, you did that, Marian. You just promoted the hell out of that episode. Appreciate you.
It was an authentic plug. I really liked
Yes,
it.
I'm glad that you brought that up because I also look at Edible Activist as this catalog, and you can kind of like pick and choose. It's like your entry point. Like, where do you want to start with? It isn't necessarily like a path or journey, right? But it's just like boom, like you put your little quarter in, and you like that's where I want to start, and that's what I'm gonna listen to, right? And so with shout out to Najee of Everybody's Juice, he didn't have this story of like I did this overhaul, I did this, I started gardening, I did X, Y. It wasn't, he said, listen, I got sick. When I first had him on my show, he's like, he made some juice, he healed himself. Now he's into supplements, which is super important.
Yeah.
Like, because you can't get everything from food. Like,
Yeah.
you cannot. Like, you just cannot, especially the older you get, right? And so I think his business platform is just really great. And I love the angle, and I love his business model. But then also we talked about like HSA and FSA too, and just really innovating, that whole sphere with like, listen, for y'all 9 to 5ers, and you got access to, HSAs and FSAs. This is another way to get access to, supplements. I know it's probably controversial for some, but I thank you for highlighting that because that might just be the starting point for someone,
Yeah.
easy breezy. So,
Right. And it's all about starting where you can and where it feels good to you.
and meet them where they are.
Yeah.
There's no judgment.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, well, since you and I met at a food as medicine networking event, or food is medicine, I'm not sure how they were phrasing it,
I don't remember.
but it was a networking, happy hour or whatever, and we bumped into each other going in the wrong entrance, actually.
We did.
Perfect. It was a very good meet cute,
It
right? But so I think because we met there, I want to end by just asking, like, what does food as medicine mean to you?
Food is medicine. Food as medicine. Food is medicine. Um, it can be a good medicine, it can be a bad medicine. But when we're talking about good medicine, it is eating foods that are, if you can, as hyper local as they possibly can be, so rich, but foods that nourish your body, that don't dysregulate your nervous system, that give you mental clarity, that give you energy, and just overall like health, just being in this state of like well-being. So food as medicine is being able to nourish your body and be able to function and to think clearly, and then also like help others, because you have that down. So that's how I would simply put it.
Awesome. I love that. Well, Melissa, I just want to thank you so much for coming here today and speaking with me, and for all the work that you're doing, for your organizing, for your storytelling, for your activism. You are an incredible force, and I look forward to following your work. And we're going to post all kinds of links in the show notes so people can find your work. But I just want to, with all my gratitude. Say thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you once again for listening to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. For more information on me, Marian, please visit my website at marianflaxman.com. For more information on my guest, Melissa L. Jones, or to find her podcast, the Edible Activist Podcast, please find the links in the show notes. This episode was produced by Brain Trust Productions and sponsored by Informed Solutions Consulting. Thank you so much once again for listening, and we will see you next time.